Oakland. This is Soundwaves. And today I have special guest. I met this lovely lady. She's a reporter for the Los Angeles Times. We met at a Bernie Sanders rally in Richmond, California. Was it 4 months ago?
I don't even know. I have no idea. Time has passed in the weirdest way the last few months. Let's
Perpetual
say 4
Tuesday.
months.
I don't know when that was. Johana. Am I saying it? Is it Johana or Johana?
Johana.
Johana Bhuiyan. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. It's been kind of a hectic week, so I'm glad to end it on a nice note.
You know, I follow you on Twitter. When you said you were taking some time off, I was like, oh, this is a perfect time to hit her up.
Yeah.
Maybe get her on the show.
Yeah, I'm actually furloughed today, so it's a good time for me to get into the podcast.
Is it kind of sad you can't really like go anywhere and do stuff?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's actually like in times like this, it's really difficult to be furloughed because our hours are really limited. So, there were things that I wanted to cover, protests that I wanted to cover, last Saturday and last Friday, and I literally couldn't. It would be illegal and technically unemployment insurance fraud. So it's really debilitating to just kind of have a limited amount of time to do the thing that actually that I'm allowed to do that may contribute to helping, further amplify voices and things like that. So it's not exactly relaxing to be furloughed.
Because there's nothing to take your mind off it, right? You can't just
I'm
just going to go for a stroll.
Yeah. So, I mean, I spent the last day kind of sitting up in, these Facebook groups for the Muslim community and just going off on people who are saying things that were, either outrightly and overtly racist, or things that people are saying that may have been well-intentioned but not executed properly. Because I'm like, I have time. If I can't cover things, then I'm going to be spending that time talking to my community and making sure that we're not being actively racist as well.
Now to your point, are you Orthodox Muslim? I
don't even really know what that means. I am practicing. I'm not like the best Muslim in the world, but I try to practice some of the fundamentals, but I am, spiritually very, a big believer of Islam and its teachings. And I try to do my best to get better every day. And I think the values that I take from Islam are participating in charity and things like that. And I try to if I'm not doing something that's explicitly a practice of Islam, I'm trying to at least bring the values of it in everything that I do.
Now, you were commenting, people that were saying things about Muslim people in media, correct?
Yeah. So I was also talking to just Muslim people about how they're, participating in protests and or not participating in protests. On the other hand, I was on Twitter talking about media's bias and discrimination and things like that. So I was kind of spending my time fighting two battles. But I mean, I do operate primarily in these two spaces, and these two spaces do require a lot of change and a lot of, introspection. And as someone who in the media, I'm not a huge decision maker, but I do have access to a lot of editors and direct access to people who are decision makers that other people don't have. I do think it's incumbent upon me to try to use that access to, at least put them on alert or have them think really deeply about how they're covering things and what they're doing, and also the burden that they're putting on people of color. I specifically was talking about, so there was this woman who used to work at Buzzfeed, and she first tweeted, and she's a Black woman, and she first tweeted about kind of the difficulty of being a Black woman at Buzzfeed, because there was this kind of undue burden put on her to, one, speak up or speak up for Black people against the things that were being published. But also, like, she was being gaslit and just a number of things. And I and a number of other BuzzFeed employees who are people of color or Black people spoke up and kind of offered our own perspectives as well. Because as I said to you before, I think it's really important. It's hard to speak out against a major media organization and continue to work in media. You don't know how you're going to be retaliated against. You don't know how you're going to be dismissed. So I did want to bring up my own experience too, as sort of a way to back her up and lend credence to what she was saying. And so that there was this sort of chorus of voices reiterating what she was saying so that they couldn't, retaliate against any single person there.
Now, what got you into journalism in the first place?
A lot of things. I think the primary thing that is that I, as a minority, in a lot of different ways, and being from Queens and in New York, there were just a lot of stories that I saw and voices that I heard that weren't being amplified or told in any really meaningful way on the national level. And just seeing the things that other people didn't see. I mean, I'm Muslim, I'm half Filipino, I'm half Bengali, I wear a hijab, like I operate on a lot of different levels. Yeah. And just seeing a lot of, frankly, misinformation and things like that. And not even just the things that were being said about us that weren't true, but just the things that were true that weren't being told. I think that was like a really big motivation for me. The other reasons was that I'm just very nosy and I talk a lot. So I figured journalism would be a good career path.
Now, did you want to get into televised media or do you prefer print media?
I definitely prefer print media. I actually hate going on TV. It's kind of like interesting because TV is a format where I as a journalist, I'm sort of being interviewed in some cases, and I respect and love a lot of TV journalists, but it's just not for me. I think print, you're really able to get across so many aspects of a story that you can't really do in the. We still have our limitations, but in a limited sort of TV clip or TV hit, it's harder to do. I did, for a really long time, and maybe will in the future, consider documentary journalism, and that's still kind of on the table at some point.
Ah, a documentarian.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing to get into, and definitely not an easy transition from print to documentaries, but I think it's a really amazing medium, and there are stories that you can tell visually that you really can never tell just through words on a paper.
Speaking of words on a paper, your most recent story is titled, and it's in the LA Times, it's titled, Tech Companies Say They Support Racial Justice. Their actions raise questions.
Yeah.
And what I really dug about what you wrote, or how you wrote it, was you took their quotes, the different organizations' quotes, and then you said what they said, but what their record shows.
Yeah.
Which is really funny because at this moment in time, we're all getting these messages in our email and throughout social media. Facebook stands behind colored people in this time of crisis.
Yeah.
In this time of crisis, Chrysler cars. They're always trying to use it to pitch their thing. So you wrote, and I love this, Amazon, what it said. The inequitable and brutal treatment of Black people in our country must stop. Together we stand in solidarity with the Black community, our employees, customers, and partners in the fight against systemic racism and injustice. Amazon said that.
Yeah.
In their New York facility, I forget how many people have passed on from COVID-19, but there was that big protest led by a Black person.
Yeah, Chris Small.
That's Chris Small. Who's like, hey, can you clean the facility like you said you were going to? Can you get us the protective equipment? There was a whole very racist smear campaign planned against him. So bad so that a higher up quit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then they run that whole kind of fluff where they kind of do the paid advertising with I don't know if it was Sinclair Media that ran it, but it was like 11
Oh,
stations.
yeah.
Someone had did the same thing where they showed, hey, look, we're washing our hands. Look, we got masks. You're not going to get the cooties from our stuff. And so that was their statement to the public, right? And
Yeah.
what the record shows, at the center of the protest demanding justice for Floyd are calls for police reform and an end to racist policing. Amazon has several contracts with law enforcement agencies.
Yeah.
I don't think people really understand how deep they are into the surveillance state.
Yeah. I mean, yes. So speaking about just the Amazon worker, like you're talking about the smear campaign, I mean, the way that they described him, it's just like basic, like dog whistle 101, like calling him inarticulate, basically saying he's not smart. And here's how we should handle and respond to his responses. And that's just like, if you want to talk like about your solidarity and support for Black people, like that's the first thing we should talk about. But yes, at the center, as we all know, of all of these protests are demands for police reform, are demands for actually defunding the police, ending police brutality. And Amazon, its technology, it's so many different companies within the Amazon umbrella, literally are continuously seeking out police and law enforcement contracts. Their company Ring, which is, they call it a neighborhood watch app, which again, neighborhood watch has been historically really disproportionately inequitable for Black people. Black people have died because of neighborhood, quote unquote neighborhood watch directives. That particular company has partnered with 200 police departments that we know of. And they say that they don't do this anymore, but they actually incentivize people to use their neighborhood watch app, which is similar to Nextdoor, where people are just like calling out like, oh, there's someone suspicious on my block. And as we've seen over and over again, the people who look suspicious, quote unquote, are typically Black and brown people. So it's just criminalizing, or helping criminalize just walking around, because these cops are looking at this app. It's not just like, oh, we're talking innocuously about someone we think it may be suspicious. Cops are literally looking at this app and seeing what people are saying. So you're giving them the tools to then over police Black and brown people.
You actually you have a quote from friend of show and a friend in life, congressional candidate Shahid Buttar. He says, given the reality of police violence with impunity in practicing primarily people of color in the United States, these kinds of acts threaten the lives of third parties who are simply, in some cases, doing their jobs or living in their own neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Amazon also, you go on to say Amazon also licenses facial recognition software called Recognition to law enforcement agencies. A study by the MIT Media Lab found that the software performed worse at identifying the gender of individuals with dark faces.
Yeah.
Although Amazon contested the validity of the findings, other facial recognition algorithms have struggled to accurately identify non-white faces. Amazon did not respond for request. There's a great book I just finished called Weapons of Math Destruction. By Kathy O'Neill, where she goes in depth about the algorithmic policing.
Yeah.
That is just, it's part of the defund the police campaign. It's part of the reason why we're seeing all this violence.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, if even like, yes, the algorithm itself is not able to, properly recognize Black and brown faces. Like that on its own is a problem. And that goes back to the fact that a lot of the people building it goes back to diversity within the tech companies. A lot of the people building these algorithms and these services are not, Black or brown people. So that's, the problem number one. But even, even if the algorithm was great, right? It was exactly accurate. It's a question of how it's being used. There is this organization in Los Angeles called Stop Police Spying, or it's something like that. I'd have to look up the exact name, but it's basically trying to stop police surveillance. And a lot of their efforts have been focused on companies like Palantir. And what they found in their studies and in their research is that, technology companies like Palantir, in some cases Amazon, help police departments basically continue their history and their process of over policing Black and brown communities. And so it's kind of like a digital redlining. They have these people who they continuously watch, and they have this sort of watch list of people. Like they continuously basically like write down an entire dossier on these people who are doing nothing beyond just existing and living and doing, living their day-to-day lives. And they create this whole list of people that they will spend their resources and focus just surveilling. And so, there's this question. A lot of people love to talk about how we need police to look at low income communities because that's where the high crime rates are. And yes, maybe there is a higher crime rate in those places, but also if the police are spending the undue resources looking at these communities, of course there's going to be a higher crime rate there because they're not really looking at the other communities and they're not really policing to the same level, white people or white communities. So even if the algorithm and the technology and the services are great, like we also have to question and interrogate how that technology is being used.
Oh, definitely. I mean, if you're not stopping, the Mercedes from double parking in, the Montclair district of Oakland, then how are you ever going to get those things into the algorithm?
Right.
It also gets into predictive policing. Also in the book, Weapons of Mass Destruction, they talk about how the cops came to the door of a guy that didn't commit a crime, but they found through the algorithms that because he lived in a certain neighborhood,
yes,
he knew people that did commit crimes.
Yeah.
So they knocked on his door and just to tell him, we're watching you.
Yeah, that's exactly what Palantir enables people to do. And that's what that watch list and dossier is. It's like you're in this community, you have these associations, so they watch you specifically. And because they, based on the algorithms, predict you may be able to, or you may be inclined to commit a crime.
So crazy.
Yeah.
And then your piece before that piece, which I really love, and I did share that on social media. I'm going to put a link to Johana's pieces in the show when I upload it. You were at the protests in was it a town hall meeting in San Francisco?
It was a kneel-in is what they called it. It was just sort of it was billed as kind of like a rally to mourn George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and a lot of other people. And it was put on by an organization in San Francisco called Justice for Mario Woods. And Mario Woods is also, another Black man who was fatally shot by the cops. So yeah, it was, billed as a kneel-in, but there were a lot of speakers that included San Francisco Mayor London Breed. It included Adante Pointer, who is a civil rights lawyer in Oakland. Jamie Foxx actually was there speaking. There was, music, there was singing, there was tears, there was celebration. It was like a really wide and broad action and movement. But there was also the SFPD police chief speaking. So that kind of, yeah. And I should say, I think that's worth mentioning because I'd also covered, a caravan in Oakland demanding justice for George Floyd. I'd covered other protests over the last few days in San Francisco and in the Bay Area. And this stood apart because it did feel like kind of the establishment sort of not co-opted, but they were a big presence at this rally. Unlike other protests and rallies, cops are sort of sitting along the sidelines waiting for something to happen. There were cops on the platform here. There were cops standing alongside the president of the San Francisco chapter of the NAACP. So it was definitely interesting is probably a good way of putting it. It felt like a city sanctioned rally.
Is that kind of against what protest is supposed to be about, or
Well, I
is
don't
that
think
what it
always, right? But like in this case, what are all of these protests protesting? Like where they're
yeah, exactly.
protesting, yeah, like they're protesting police brutality, police violence. I think, some of the people that I spoke to after the rally and asked them about what their opinions on, the mayor being there, but also the police chief being there. And, some of them said, yes, I'm glad that they were there because it is important for us to have someone to hold accountable. And while they were there, to their credit, they did make a commitment to really, take a look at the way that SFPD operates, and they committed to change. But even then, a lot of the people that I had spoke to also said, "Well, I'm glad they said that, but it's like we have to see what they actually do." And when the police chief went on, like when Mayor London Breed went on, people were really celebrating. Something that she kind of said over and over again was that, I am a mayor, but I'm a Black woman first. And that really resonated with a lot of people. But, when the police chief went on, they had to ask, the crowd to be respectful before he came on. And then when he did come on, like immediately people were like, what are you doing here? Like, and, one woman in particular, her name is Kia. And I spoke to her for my story. She, really respectfully, but, loudly questioned him and pushed him and said, what are you going to do about it? And he kept talking about also, when I take my uniform off, I'm a Black man. And she said, I know that and I respect that, but what are you going to do about this? Like, yeah, you are a Black man in a uniform in a high position. You're in a perfect position to do something about this. What are you going to do? And his response was that the SFPD isn't perfect. We are committed to change. So take that for what it is.
Are you allowed to comment on kind of the role of policing as far as like, so for example, like you have a police chief that's saying, hey, I know we're not perfect. We're doing our best. Having Alex Vitale on the show a week or so ago talking about the end of policing, a big problem with police budgets is, there are these bloated budgets that go into, was it New York expense was like $18 million a year on body cameras, which,
Yeah,
in my opinion, I feel are nothing but and I'll say it again, a selfie stick for cops.
yeah,
It doesn't matter. It hasn't changed anything. What police officers do in front of a camera that they know is on, from planting dope to murdering people, beating people to oblivion with the camera on.
yeah. I mean, forget the police camera. There are people recording them, and they're still doing it.
Still doing it. Implicit bias training doesn't work. So, yeah, you're doing the best job you can, but I'd rather money go to getting some sort of mental health resources involved and responding to a lot of the problems that law enforcement is responding to, because in a city like San Francisco, we've definitely criminalized homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
And this mayoral administration, I feel like, has almost doubled down on it. And there's certain, when the police arrest you for these small crimes and you get out and you have issues with your housing, especially if you're living on the margins already. I work at a shelter, and that's a lot of the people that I deal with are like that. Well, I got out and I lost my housing. Now I'm on the street. Yeah. And if you're on the street, now you're a vagrant, and now you have to deal with the police again.
Yeah.
It's just this real negative feedback loop, and I feel like this administration is really all about it. So to have a police chief there like, hey, we're doing what we can. It's like,
yeah.
Are you?
Right. I mean, so this is not, my personal opinion, but I can talk about what happened there. I am limited as a journalist in what I can express my opinion about. But I mean, yeah, let's talk about kind of the irony and maybe the the hypocrisy of the mayor and the police chief being there talking about how they're supporting this movement, how they're supporting the right to protest, while also instating a curfew. And a curfew in response to a protest, as the ACLU has argued in their lawsuit against San Francisco and several other Bay Area and California counties and cities, is a means to silence the protest. It's a First Amendment violation. They've since lifted the curfew, but it does stand in stark contrast to what they're saying. It's like what you do when you instate a curfew is you criminalize any action that's happening after the curfew. And if this is in response to a protest, what are you criminalizing? You're criminalizing the protest. There was this curfew protest in Oakland. Either yesterday or the day before, put on by the Anti-Police Terror Project and several other organizations. And the Oakland police say that they specifically they were told to avoid that area and not to police that action in that movement. And the protest went on through the night. It was peaceful. It turned into a dance party. People, were loudly and very peacefully and respectfully expressing their opinion. And what does that tell me, both as a journalist and as just a person? It shows to me that the protests are getting violent, or it may be that the lack of police presence is the thing that kept it peaceful. And it also shows kind of the arbitrary nature of a curfew. Like, why do you need a curfew when people left to their own devices are completely fine peacefully protesting on their own? So to have, these city lawmakers and regulators stand up there and people in power stand up there and talk about how they stand in solidarity with the protesters, it didn't feel super genuine. And this is, in me talking to a lot of people, there were definitely people who felt really, encouraged by them being there because it felt like they were listening to them. But then there were people who were like, well, if we were here a few hours later, we would not be allowed to be here and they wouldn't be here.
So crazy. Now, you've been covering the protests here in the Bay Area. Have you been going to Oakland or just mostly San Francisco?
So I went to the Caravan in Oakland on Sunday.
Okay. What have you noticed from your reporting? Because, you see, depending on what news you watch, I watched a Tucker Carlson clip.
Why?
And because I was told that Fox News is fair and balanced.
Okay.
And he, definitely did the whole demonizing the protesters thing, and that becomes the rhetoric becomes looting and rioting, right? 92. What are when we think about 92 in LA, we think about the Rodney King videotape and a smoldering city and people running out of stores with TVs in their hands. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's the same image that we're going to see here. The one thing that I think is changing the narrative is the global solidarity of it all.
Yeah.
What is your take on that as far as the narrative control on what we're talking about with these protests?
Yeah. I mean, it's something, again, as someone in the media that I've been, calling out my own organization about. I think the framing has been really disproportionately on looting up until recently. And I'm not the only person calling out the LA Times about this. Other people are calling out the other organizations internally. My coworkers and I have, expressed a lot of the same issues, which is that we have given sort of undue focus on looting and things like that. And I think they've taken our concerns to heart and have tried to change that. And it is a problem, right? Because one, we don't fully know and understand who is doing the looting, right? And so there are these different narratives that are coming out, which is one is that these looters are taking advantage of the movement and they're separate from the protesters. But then there's, people saying, well, no, actually this is a form of protest. It's that damages to the businesses, to these corporate chains is a form of protest. And I think the thing is we don't really need to focus too much on that because it's besides the point. Why are we not talking more about the fact that of George Floyd was murdered, more about the fact that Breonna Taylor have not seen any charges, for her murder. That's where our focus should be. And I think the media has a real responsibility to make sure that our framing is exactly right on this. I think it's hard, and to the credit of, not to knock any of my coworkers' work, like they're putting themselves on the line to really report all of this out. It's just a matter of what are we emphasizing and what are we prioritizing? But to the credit of the media, or at least as kind of, an idea of how this works, is that, we have to, our instinct is to report things as they're happening, and the things that are breaking news and things that are, new information. And so I think that instinct sometimes can cloud the way that we're covering things. And so we do have to, the media industry, to take a step back and make sure that everything that we're doing, and everything that we're talking about and the things that we're giving priority to, really is, falls in line with all of our ethics and directives, which is that, we had, for example, and I hate to even I'm not calling out everyone at the LA Times, but I'm saying we had this gallery that just focused on images of looting. And a question that we have to ask ourselves as journalists with every single thing that we cover is who is this serving? What public service, what larger journalistic mission does this fulfill here? Just, a gallery. What is the point of that without much context, without, also talking about the protests? And I want to give credit to the LA Times, because after some people had expressed concerns, they have changed their framing and have changed their focus. Our top stories are about peaceful protesting. Our top stories are about the real responses from cities, the LAPD, for example, or at least Mayor Eric Garcetti cutting the LAPD budget, things like that. And this is also happening in the matter of days, right? This is a fast moving thing. We are trying to keep up with it just as everyone else is trying to keep up with it. But we do have, we do have a responsibility, because I have seen in real time the effects of focusing on looting. Like I said, I was sitting in this Facebook group that, is this sort of community group for Muslims, mostly on the East Coast. They talk about, job postings, things like that. But there were a lot of posts decrying looting and damaged businesses and things like that. And it just so heavily skewed toward that. And I kept speaking up, and I posted several things, because I was like, yes, of course, if you have a small business that has been damaged, I can't dismiss your pain. But the people who are talking about that, are you also talking about the police brutality that has been going on for centuries? Are you also talking about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor? Are you also talking about the core issue here? Or are you focusing all of your energy and anger on looting and businesses? People don't respond well to that.
Do you think that it becomes kind of this, again, like a feedback loop, this negative feedback loop of, here's a protest about police violence, mm-hmm. and then here is the response, which is going to be every so often you get outrage.
Yeah.
92 didn't happen in a vacuum.
Right.
There were years of horrible treatment by LAPD to its poor citizens. Mm-hmm. And then you have Ferguson. Again, doesn't happen in a vacuum. You have years of systemic crap treatment to the citizens of that area, the black citizens of that area, mm-hmm. where the police were just kind of this militarized force that gave them these tickets and fines they couldn't pay. And then you have not just George Floyd, but you had Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, mm-hmm. and George Floyd in succession, coupled with all the others we've seen towards the end of the Obama second term, starting with probably Trayvon Martin. We're just talking about the more
recent,
the ones with more notoriety.
Yeah.
To now, and again, it becomes almost like this, what a killer might call it, murder porn, mm-hmm. where you keep having to watch the image of the cop with his knee on the neck, which is just so symbolic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you get the outrage response, and then the narrative changes from outrage And the outrage had some solidarity, right? There's all kinds of people protesting, all colors protesting, genders. It's beautiful. Then it turns into, well, they're tearing stuff up and we need more control because they're tearing stuff up. And then you get the one small business owner that gets his or her shop torn up. Mm-hmm. And you see them crying, and then everyone feels sorry, and we forget about the reasons why the shop was torn up.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No,
go
I
ahead.
mean, everything you're saying, that's exactly why it's just so important for us to make sure that even if, yes, we absolutely should cover like every aspect of the protest, but are we also offering context? Are we also making sure that like maybe that isn't the headline? Like maybe there is a better headline for us to focus on. Like you said, like, yeah, I mean, the Rodney King riots, like the images that come out of it are not like, for those who know about Rodney King, like they can remember it being this moment of anger and anguish over his death. But a lot of people, yeah, they think about the images of people taking TVs out of businesses, right? Like, are we doing that again? And like, that is something we have to interrogate our everything that we're doing, especially when the stakes are this high at every turn. And I love the LA Times because we do try to do that. We do try to hold ourselves accountable. But just like not everyone's getting it right. And I think there is this like this flaw, or there's this sort of like both sideism that like a lot of journalists love to, like we have to show all sides. And it's like, sure, we can show all sides, but we have to do that within context. I think the most flagrant example of that is like the New York Times opinion section publishing.
Tom Cotton.
Yeah, publishing that. Like, it's like, well, is that really both sides when it's like there's a fact, which is like, people are being attacked at the hands, like innocent civilians, and forget the word innocent, civilians who are exercising their right to protest are being attacked by cops and the National Guard. Like, do we need another side to that? I don't think so. Right. So it's like, I think there are people who like hold tight, who like look at journalistic ethics as this sort of blanket thing that kind of applies just without any nuances to every single situation. And it doesn't, right? Like, for example, journalists are limited in their ability to participate in protests that may have like a political leaning or, express political opinions. But, stepping outside your home as a Black person right now is a political act. Like me walking outside of my house with a hijab on is, in a lot of cases, a political act. So to tell me that there are some things that I can't, like what you call bias, I call perspective. Like there's some things to tell me that there's some things that I can and cannot say, or like we have to interrogate and like reformat our thinking about some of the things that we hold as journalistic standards, because they don't apply carte blanche to every single situation. It shouldn't be like politicized for me to say that Black Lives Matter, right? Like that's just like the least I could say in this situation. Does Black Lives Matter as an organization have like, a political arm that is pushing for different laws? Absolutely. But like for me to say Black Lives Matter alone should not be something that I'm limited in doing as a journalist. And I don't think organizations are doing that, but I should also be able to participate in a protest that's calling for justice for the murder of a person. And so I think as an industry, we do have to kind of step back often and always, but particularly when the stakes are this high, and look at the standards that we have and say, do we need to look at, like, is this just like this carte blanche thing that like we can't interrogate and make sure that in this situation it doesn't do more harm than good? And so, yeah, I mean, I think like we're seeing like the real time effects of like, of some of the flaws in the media industry happening on our streets, happening in the way that police are enforcing, laws. Right. I think I was listening to a workshop by Muslim Anti-Racist Coalition, which is a really great organization. And they're having this conversation, this really tough conversation about like, anti-Blackness within the Muslim community. And they're talking about corner stores and things like that. And people are defending the store owner who, called the cops on, he didn't call the cops, one of his employees called the cops on George Floyd. And people were saying like, look, like they're just like, following the law. Like you're supposed to call the cops when you see a counterfeit bill. But Marguerite Azizi, who is the co-founder of Muslim ARC, was like, well, I mean, the Nazis had laws too. Like, there were laws in Nazi Germany. Like, do you need to absolutely follow every single one of those laws? Like, maybe not. So yeah, I mean, it's like we need to like really at every turn interrogate everything that we're doing. Like, it's not, we can't afford to get this wrong on any level at this point.
Yeah. I don't know if you read Cornel West.
I do.
He wrote something recently in The Guardian, and I'm just going to read a little excerpt from it, and I want to get your take on it. The fundamental question at the moment is, can this failed social experiment be reformed? The political duopoly of an escalating neo-fascist Donald Trump-led Republican Party and a fatigued Joe Biden-led neoliberal Democratic Party, in no way equivalent, yet both beholden to Wall Street and the Pentagon, are symptoms of a decadent leadership class. The weakness of the labor movement and the present difficulty of the radical left to unite around a nonviolent revolutionary project of democratic sharing and redistribution of power, wealth, and respect are signs of a society unable to regenerate the best of its past and present. Any society that refuses to eliminate or attenuate dilapidated housing, decrepit school systems, mass incarceration, massive unemployment and underemployment, inadequate health care, and its violations of rights and liberties is undesirable and unsustainable. That is a piece from... Are you like, is that can you from what you've been seeing at the protests, is this kind of the question that we're not really, or is this the question that they're asking at the protests in some way, shape, or form?
Whether we can reform society?
Yeah.
I think that a lot of these organizers who have been doing this, for years and years would not be doing this if they didn't think that there was some semblance of hope to reform society. But I think what they're asking for goes a lot further than just like, for example, reforming the police. Like, people are asking to defund the police, to start over. And in Minneapolis, it seems like the city council is listening. They're talking about, city council members are talking about, dismantling and starting fresh again with the police department there. And I think it's like it doesn't feel like there's real change happening, but it does seem like right now there is this moment that they need to leverage. The organizers across the country need to leverage in order to actually make that change happen. That was what I kept hearing at the Caravan in Oakland. Like, what are we going to do now? Like, all of these organizations that are fighting for social justice for Black people they're talking. They may have different tactics, but the point is that we have this amazing, there was, thousands of cars driving through Oakland at that point. We have this unique moment that we can leverage to actually make change. What happens next? Like, how are we going to do that? How do we build something that really does move the needle? Because these groups haven't protested. This is not the first time they're protesting, right? Like, one person I spoke to was like, I was out in these streets of Oakland, like in 2014 when, protesting the shooting of another person. Yeah. They've been fighting for years, but this is the first time that this moment and this movement has seen like this much momentum across the country. One reporter I saw was tweeting today from in San Francisco and another in New York. Like, they were on their way to one protest, and as they were on their way to that protest, they came across two others. Like, this is happening in a way that it's never happened before across the country. There has to be, that gives me hope, and it sounds like it's giving organizers hope that there's real opportunity for change here and real opportunity for reform. And I think at the base level, like regulators, city lawmakers, the federal government, they just at the very least, they literally cannot ignore it, right? Like, beyond what happens beyond that, and hopefully this, that's another thing that a lot of organizers have said. They're like, thank you for showing up today, especially non-Black allies, but will you show up, once the protest subsides? Will you do something after this happens? They're asking people to continue to show up. And it is me as a non-Black person, it is incumbent upon me to like find ways to continue to show up, because this is not going to, like, these protests alone are not going to solve anything. So I think I do think that there is hope. Again, like I'm a journalist. I literally, like, my job is to be cynical. So I don't know. I don't know what change is going to come out of this, and I don't always put a lot of faith in like the system to regulate itself. Just like I don't really put a lot of faith in the tech companies to regulate themselves. I do think that there is something that's unprecedented happening right now.
So that was, thank you. That was a lot right there. This is what I think is going to, this is just my, you talk about being cynical. This is my cynical take.
Mm-hmm.
I think that these 4 cops are going to be sacrificial lambs, because in my 42 years on this planet, I've never seen such a global outrage and so much solidarity. And I think that the chant defund the police is something people can get behind more so than abolish the police.
Yeah.
And it means more to the radical left than police reform. I think they're going to throw the book at all 4 officers. Whatever the max time is, I think they're going to get. And then I think there's going to be a lot of back patting and people are going to go back to brunch.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think that's a real risk. And it's a real risk, but it starts, I think, and this is, not to take away from the broader point, but it does start like on an individual level, right? Making sure that the actions that you're taking aren't simply to sort of absolve you of your obligation to do something. I think, hashtag Blackout Tuesday was kind of an example of that. And it's like, it's like really well-intentioned people, right? Like they're like, I want to show solidarity. I want to show support. But what I think people forget and don't realize in some cases is that the people organizing behind Black Lives Matters, behind all of these other organizations, have been doing this for years and are incredibly strategic, are incredibly deliberate about what they do and what they promote and what they endorse. And so we have to take our lead from them, and not, these other groups that are kind of just coming into the fray. Again, well-intentioned, but it may not be like thinking about strategy. A lot of Black organizers, when Blackout Tuesday happened, were like, this is not only like counterproductive, because what you're doing is erasing like years of like archival information under the Black Lives Matter hashtag, but also like, it potentially takes away from the movement, because like now people feel like, oh, I did what I needed to do. I like said my piece, and I'm done. And so we can't have that. I think like the thing that I'm trying to get across, like in my own circles, is just like, there are real things we can do, and there are very deliberate movements and actions we can participate in. And we should be taking our lead from the organizers who've been doing this for years. Because I do think that there is this real risk of us being like, all right, we showed up once, like, I texted my one Black friend and said that to check in on them, and I put a Black square up, right? Like, and I'm good. And it's just like, it's not like the work, there's so much work to be done. And I think, an organization I'd love to kind of, endorse and bring attention to is Muslim ARC again, like, because they had a workshop the other day, and it was really informative. As someone who, I'm not like an activist, I'm not, well versed and educated in like just social justice movements and things like that, but they like listed a series of questions we should be asking ourselves as individuals, like what can we do to make sure that we're not just not hurting the social justice movements and contributing to anti-Blackness, but also like how can we actively make sure that we are fighting anti-race or anti-Blackness. And one of the questions that they pose, and I think it's an important one for individuals to think about all the time, is like, what is your motivation for this particular action that you're about to do? Like, who is it serving? Is it about ego? Is it about like just kind of fulfilling an obligation that you feel pressured to do or to fulfill? And are we also questioning anti-Blackness within our own circles, even when it is uncomfortable? Like one of the speakers said that one of the most one of the biggest privileges we have as non-Black people is being able to prioritize our comfort in situations like that. Right. Like, whereas like Black people like can't be like, someone says the N-word to them or even something much more subtle, like Black people can't, they don't get to shy away because they're uncomfortable. Like, we definitely get to, and making sure that we're having those uncomfortable conversations are really, really important. And I do think that there are people who are super well intentioned, but we have to remember, another question they pose is, sometimes we get it wrong. Are you committed to getting it right next time, and how will you do that? I myself was talking to someone. There's this horrible is a bad way of putting it, but there's this like line that a lot of brown people, Asian people, non-Black Muslim people, they trot out this line, which is like, Black people, their fight for civil rights paved the way for us, so we should support them. And it's like, I understand that your sentiment here, but it's really dangerous, because what you're doing is qualifying our support for Black lives. What you're doing is saying that, the value of a Black life is based on what they've done for me. And like, yeah, it's like what's happening is that there are people out there who are then using, because you've qualified it, they're working to disqualify it. There are people in the Muslim community saying things like, well, where were Black people when Palestinians were getting killed? Like, and it's like, well, they were there actually, like, to get that across. But like, also like, it shouldn't matter. It like really shouldn't matter. Like, it shouldn't matter. Like, what someone does in service of our civil rights should not be a reason, like the only reason we are supporting Black lives. Like, historically, definitely correct. But it like, when you bring that, I've brought this up to several people, they get defensive, because they kind of hide behind this, like, they're well-intentioned and they're like, they're kind of unwilling to learn. And that's really dangerous for anything that we're doing, because I don't know anything, right? Like, I am constantly learning. I am constantly seeking out knowledge about how best to be an ally and how best to contribute to anti-racism. Mm-hmm. But people sort of hide behind their liberalism, and they hide behind, they say, I'm liberal, so my progressive values should be enough. And it's like, that isn't enough in a lot of cases. Like, Minneapolis is an incredibly liberal city. And because of that, like, maybe there isn't really a tendency to like question and interrogate the police department, the city regulators, and things like that. And actually, Vanessa Taylor is an incredible, Black Muslim journalist from Minnesota, and she's written a lot about this. Like, it is dangerous to be like so liberal that you think that you're above racism, right? Like, it's dangerous to like not be like, you don't feel as much pressure if you've said something to then like introspect and learn and interrogate the racism that may be just deeply entrenched in your culture or whatever it is, and interrogate your privilege. And I've seen that in real time. And so I do think like it's so important for us to like, whether we're well-intentioned or not like poorly intentioned, like just like constantly seek knowledge and figure out how best to deliberately support anti-racism causes. That was a lot. I'm sorry. I told you I like to talk.
No. That's totally fine. Hey, this show is about you talking. Me sitting back. I asked you on here for a reason. So
yeah, no, I appreciate it. Again, I mean, I think I like when you asked me, I was like, well, I don't want to take up space that I don't have, but I really do appreciate you, asking me.
And now look at you having fun running your mouth. But to your point, what you were saying, back to being serious, we live in a world where the Democratic Party's presidential candidate literally said, hey, just had the cops trained to shoot him in the leg. Everybody wins. Black guy lives. Black guy goes to jail. Both sides happy. Shot leg. He's fine. Limps a little. That's liberalism to me in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Why don't they shoot him in the leg? And I think what we're seeing right now, this is just my opinion, and you're out there in them streets, as the young people say. We're actually seeing people question the role of police in them streets.
Yeah.
We're finally getting multiple books written about algorithmic policing and how it's detrimental to our society.
Right.
And we're seeing, even from a global standpoint to the Palestine point, I don't know if you know Nora Barrows Friedman. She's also a journalist. She's the editor of the Electronic Intifada.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking about how what you see used on Palestinian people from the Israeli military is what we see here in the States with policing. That's like unfortunately, Gaza is like a testing ground for a lot of what we get when it comes to occupational policing, right?
Right.
How do you occupy with the military force? And that's just what it is. These cats just deal with it. That's just what it is.
Mm-hmm.
I think we saw it with the Moms for Housing when you had those tanks and everybody was in Kevlar and full riot gear to take out 4 unarmed women out of a house and babies. There's an overdoing it. We don't need all the money we spend on the riot gear can go to protective equipment for our doctors and nurses and frontline employees.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you just look at like the budgets for like police departments across the country, it's exorbitant. I mean, I was looking at NYPD budget. I think it's 5.9 billion right now. Comparatively, the New York Department of Health is something like 1.6 billion. Still a good amount, but billion with a B.
With a B.
5.9 billion versus 1.6 or something along those lines. Like that alone paints like a very clear picture.
And this is where we are again. Here's a perfect example. 750 billion military spending, 6.5 billion CDC budget.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the comparative cost between of riot gear versus PPE is super interesting as well. I mean, it's just like, I think it's like $500 for riot gear per officer, and PPE is about $15, and yet all of the cops were equipped with riot gear, and we had nurses and doctors in garbage bags.
Disgusting, isn't it?
It's something.
I can say, because I do have to deal with the Oakland Police Department quite often in my work, they don't have PPE either. So when they come to the facility, they don't have masks sometimes.
Yeah.
And when they do, it's funny. It's like, wow, you'd rather spend more money on riot gear for these cats than even masks for them. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. And that's the world we live in. Well, Johana, I know you're a busy person. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I do want to say again, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. Thank you so much for taking the time to come up and introduce yourself to me in Richmond some time ago. It feels like years.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I so appreciate you inviting me on this. My role is, as a journalist and also as a Muslim person to, speak hopefully truth to power. And I hope I didn't cross any lines here. Let's see what my bosses have to say. But I think there are things that are just facts, and I hope I can present those facts.
Well, again, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
I'm going to play some music. Don't hang up.
Okay.